So getting into Guild Wars 2 is a lot of fun, and sometimes it can be, well, rough. You cruise through most of the game until you hit a champion mob that pushes you down like a Mack truck, and now it's back to the drawing board for your build. Where do we start? Well, that's where I'm going to help you out. These are the core build guides for new players in Guild Wars 2. I will exclusively be using items and builds that are available to the core game, and I will be showcasing them against 3 champion level mobs from the Heart of Thorns expansion. An easier one being the Malfunctioning Golem, a moderate one being the Chak Broodmother, and a difficult one being the damn Death Toads from Verdant Brink. I have also included links in the description below for each of these builds for your perusal. I will also state that these builds are meant to be safer and more new player friendly. They are not the most optimal, or we'll say S tier, but they do provide a great onboarding for endgame open world builds, especially for the new players who are just getting into the game. Anyway, let's get into it. Starting out with my Elementalist, first and the simplest build that comes to mind is a focus on the staff using Signet skills with an Elemental Elite. We choose this route because your Elemental can take on quite a bit, all the while you're pumping out some good condition damage all around. Now, the downside to this build is that it uses Celestial gear. Now, why is that a downside? Celestial gear can be a bit expensive to purchase straight from the trading post, but I have included a link of how you can get a number of stat selectable gear for fairly easily from World vs. World. That is in the description below. Essentially, because of how this build runs, you can use your Signets off cooldown while maintaining the passive effect. Signet of Air offers a stun break, while Earth and Fire burn and bleed the enemy with a number of conditions. The real variable here in this build is the elite skill Greater Elemental, which changes depending on which attunement you are in when you use it. My main thought is essentially using Fire Elemental for most fights, as the DPS is fantastic, but you can also use Earth Elemental for the extra tankiness against tougher mobs. In some senses, you could probably get away with the Water Elemental for the extra healing, but if you have one tanking for you, healing probably won't be an issue here. Also, a plus is that this build does not need an excessive amount of APM to succeed. And honestly, you can sit between Fire and Earth attunement for the condition damaging effects and be perfectly fine. I would recommend the Water attunement for healing, as it applies a number of strong effects, not only including healing over time, but an Ice aura that reduces incoming damage. Keep an Air attunement available for the mobility and the crowd control, and you're all set. Very straightforward and straight to the point. So for the Guardian, I chose a power build that focuses on strong sword strike damage paired with defensive capabilities of the shield. The main emphasis of this build is to utilize the Resolution boon. Maintaining this effect increases your damage capabilities greatly. Not to mention that there are passive healing skills in each of your weapon sets, both with the Greatsword as well as the shield. This build also offers a ton of mobility with the Greatsword's leap and then the sword main hand Shadow Step. If you need to, and even in a pinch, you can use Advance to gain swiftness to move faster, but this also plays in another way. Each time that you use a Virtue or have an Aegis block an attack, you gain Resolution, which is essentially a DPS bump. Not to mention save yourself, granting resolution for a long period of time. However, I'd advise against using this purely for the resolution, as it is the build's main stun break. This build's heal skill is Litany of Wrath, which allows you to heal for a portion of your outgoing damage, meaning the more DPS you pump while this is active, the more healing you get. So try to use this right before you get into your Greatsword rotation, as this is where most of your damage will come from. Also, special note is Relic of the Brawler, which grants you 10% increased outgoing damage whenever you gain resolution or protection, is the must of this build. So obviously this bad boy is up all the damn time. This build does offer quite a few ways to block attacks, so keep that in mind and not spamming them too much so you don't waste your Aegis boon. Solid damage, solid defenses, and solid sustain. Okay, so I absolutely love this Thief's build here. It is simply a double pistol unload spam setup. Not only does this provide a ridiculous amount of damage, but it is essentially self-sustaining. With the trait Invigorating Precision, you are healed passively for your critical strike damage, meaning that while you are pumping out these critical hits and high damage, you are just sucking in all this healing. This build also features multiple escapes and distractions to offer windows to deal tons of damage. Thieves Guild can be used interchangeably with Basilisk Venom, however, I like the distraction of Thieves Guild against harder hitting mobs, as despite being elusive and having great sustain, the Thief still can be bursted down fairly quickly. This build is straight Berserkers all the way, as the only other stat that would be arguable in that position could be Vitality, but then again, everything else is going full offensive with this build, so why not lean into that? Interestingly enough, using the dual attack Unload with double pistols refunds 66% of the initiative cost if all attacks hit, meaning you can simply spam Unload, hitting all of your marks and having enough initiative to utilize it again. And if you are caught somehow, you have 2 separate stun breaks as well as a DPS cooldown. Seriously, to play this build, all you need to do is just keep moving and keep shooting. Just be mindful of your position and you're all set. High damage, high sustain, and lots of gunpowder. So with the Necromancer, I think one of the best options is always going with some minions, especially when we were talking about core build. And of course, many of the Necromancer's weapon skills focus around condition damage. So let's orient around that. Now, to be sure, full minion Mancer can work. However, having some extra damage cooldowns or maybe a stun break or 2 is usually a better option for all-purpose building. This particular build uses a scepter dagger paired with a staff. The Scepter is your main damage dealer and applies a number of conditions, all the while your Flesh Golem is able to tank most mobs straight up without concern. Shroud can be used aggressively or reactionary, as it not only deals fantastic damage, but it can also save your life, especially while you're in a stun, to be able to slip into Death Shroud and tank some hits with your extra health. It should be noted that this build does not have a traditional stun break, of course, but you can also swap in Spectral Walk, for example, in place of Signet of Spite for, of course, the stun break and some extra mobility at the cost of some damage. Because there are so many different conditions being applied here, I like to use Rune of the Afflicted, as the Necromancer has bleeding, has poison, has all these different things, all being applied by various abilities. The main focus of this build is to cycle through Scepter and Staff and swap into Death Shroud for DPSing, as your minions can basically take all the beating while you pump out the damage. Some mobs can kill your Flesh Golem, so be warned about that, as then typically the mobs will come after you, but the Golem can usually be summoned back before this becomes a bigger problem. Personally, I find it that the mobs will just then focus on the other minions that I'm fielding, and by the time they get to me, the Flesh Golem is ready to go. So this is a fairly safe build. Straight up, straightforward, just keep slapping with your conditions and keep your minions up and you're good to go. Now we have the Warrior, the Anger Monkey, but honestly, it is just an absolute sustained beast. This build focuses on using a greatsword paired with an axe shield combo. This build also generates a ton of might, as that is the main source of sustain for it, with the trait Might Makes Right, which each time we gain might, we are healed and gain a bit of endurance. When we dodge roll near an enemy and when we strike them, we gain might, which then turns into more healing and then more endurance, literally feeding the system forward. The greatsword deals fantastic damage, and paired with the focus of Berserker's gear, it makes sense that we are more offensively oriented. The axe is not to be slept on either. It can provide great damage as well as vulnerability, not to mention the shield offering a 3-second block with some crowd control. The main focus of this build is to outpace enemies, even if they are champion level mobs, just by doing your standard rotation and dodge rolling. It'll offer you tons of healing, tons of endurance, all the while you are just beating the enemies down. The main focus of your burst skills are of course damage output, but they also function as sustain, because we spec into Adrenal Health and Cleansing Ire, which not only removes conditions when we use burst skills, but also heals us even more. We also spec into Burst Mastery, providing fantastic improvements to the burst skills. Also to be mentioned, with all this other healing going on, our main heal skill, Mending, has such a short cooldown that it can be used aggressively, even in times where we might not feel like we're in a ton of danger. Regardless, we are able to put out a ton of damage and then just soak it all back up, making the warrior upfront and personal fighting a breeze. Definitely recommend this build. So one of my favorite and honestly hardest hitting builds featured here is the Ranger with a greatsword longbow combo. Not only does this pump out some incredible damage, but honestly, you could just sit in longbow forever against most open world mobs without ever having to worry about enemies getting close to you. This build has an emphasis of swapping pets in to offer intermittent DPS cooldowns through lesser Clarion Bond and lesser Quickening Zephyr, which for a short period is that massive DPS increase. This build has basic damage boosters in Sikkim and Strength of the Pact Elite skill, while also bringing a stun break and a 6-second invulnerability. This build also moves incredibly fast, bouncing between longbow and greatsword. However, the greatsword hits hard up close between the swoop ability as well as a maul, hilt bash, maul combo. So your burst is on point as well. Admittedly, a drawback of this build is the lack of true condition cleansing, so enemies that can apply a ton of conditions may have an edge over you, but all in all, it's fairly straightforward. Swap your pets, use your abilities, use basically everything on cooldown, and you are good to go. Okay, so the Revenant is an interesting one, focusing heavily on the double swords and a staff combination, of course with the assassin and dwarf stances. These stances work well in conjunction with each other, as thinking of like assassin for offense and dwarf for defense. The emphasis of this Revenant build is to have sustain through our consistent attacks and battle scar procs that seal HP when you deal damage, offering a ton of sustain, which also means that the main counter to this build is heavy burst. Because many of the skills in each one of these stances require energy to utilize, you may find yourself low on energy at some points and unable to get yourself out of trouble by utilizing the skills. So positioning as well as dodge rolling at the appropriate times are key for this build. As far as gear, we run full berserkers here, as well as running Relic of the Thief. Again, because of our abilities running off of a resource system, we can get a free, consistent damage increase basically all the time. If you want to run some more HP with your build and need a little bit more, we'll say, sustainability, you could run some vitality stats, for example, but the sustain is really good, and if you can pay attention and can avoid the things that are going to put you into trouble, you can absolutely wreck most enemies in open world. Your basic rotation is simple, honestly. In assassin stance, you just keep up impossible odds while using your sword abilities 2 and 4 off cooldown. There you go. You may need to dodge some things as mentioned, but again, the crux of this build is that you play a little bit more defensively minded. Your staff does offer, by the way, good healing as well as a block, so don't neglect it. Sometimes swapping into there and using some of those abilities can really help along with your sustain. Not to mention your dwarf stance offers some damage mitigation with forced engagement, so then that way you can heal all the while taking less damage, so keep that in mind. Straightforward to the point, always going to be Shiro for some reason. So out of all of these builds, the Mesmer may be one of the more difficult ones to handle, as they rely heavily on the clones and phantasms to do the tanking as well as to do your DPS. Luckily, this build offers tons of clone generation, as well as escapes and illusion. This build utilizes a greatsword double sword combo that can deal immense strike damage, and not to mention tons of crowd control and defensives. This build also takes your phantasms, which are your short-term super effective clones, grants them a strong boon, and then transfers that boon to you once they are finished doing what they need to do. Not to mention, you deal increased outgoing damage against targets that don't have boons and targets that have less percentage health towards you. Seriously, utilizing the greatsword for the phantasmal berserkers and following up with a strong mind rack combo can deal a ton of damage. I do run Signet of Inspiration here in this build, as I like the random buff generation, not to mention the occasional quickness or alacrity that pops up. You could probably go with a more defensive skill such as Decoy or Signet of Midnight for the stealth escapes, if you see fit. The main DPS of this build is through your greatsword, but it should also be known that your double sword combo offers a block as well as a short-term evade, so it can be used strategically to still be very effective. Keep that in mind. Lastly, we have the Engineer. Now, the Engineer loves explosions, right? And I think that's the perfect way to go. This build utilizes a rifle with a weapon set combo of grenades. Not only does it go down the explosive line for packing a punch, it also heals and grants barriers while we are all DPSing. If we get to a point that we are in danger, the build includes not only a stealth option in Toss Elixir S, but rocket boots and even jump shot for escapes. Despite not having turrets, they can still be elusive and pretty damn tough to bring down. Not to mention the passive healings and defenses, along with some other passive regeneration. The build, of course, is power oriented, and given that we we are using said rifle, but it should also be noted that we do provide quite a few conditions onto the target, which plays perfectly into our traded skill Modified Ammunition, which causes us to deal more damage to a target for every condition that they have. So our real focus is to utilize our rifle skills, swap to grenade kit, load them up with a ton of conditions, then back to blasting with the rifle. And if the engineer needs to, the supply drop elite skill offers great healing, a massive stun, and pretty good damage and distraction for larger enemies. Bing bang boom, the engineer's got it all. If this was helpful and you are looking for some more new player information, click this video here. Otherwise, stay caffeinated, folks.